Hey everyone, welcome to Finding Your Inner Mr. Rogers. I'm Todd Faber. I believe in a world of noise and speed, the most radical thing we can be is kind. We often think of leadership as being in charge, but Fred Rogers taught us that true leadership is about being in service to the dignity of others. Today, we're joined by retired Brigadier General Jack Hammond, someone who's doing the hard, beautiful work of leading with a heart wide open. As a retired brigadier general who now leads home base, healing the invisible wounds of war, his leadership is about the transition from command and control to compassion and care. Jack spent over 30 years leading troops in some of the world's most challenging environments, including command roles in Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, he leads a different kind of mission as the CEO of Home Base, a Red Sox Foundation and Mass General Hospital program. Jack has traded the battlefield for a healing field, dedicated to treating the invisible wounds of war for veterans and their families. He is a leader who proves that the greatest strength of a warrior is the courage to be vulnerable. Welcome to the neighborhood, Jack.
Thanks, Todd. It's truly a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm glad. I will tell you that, when I first decided to do this podcast, you were one of the first people I thought about. I don't know if you remember this, but we met a dozen years ago, at least, when you were a keynote for my nonprofit event. Uh, Afterwards, you gave me your cell and said, "Call anytime." Sadly, but interestingly enough, about 3 months after, I was actually at a client's office. His admin had told me about her son, who had recently returned from his second tour in Iraq and was really struggling. I reached out to you, and with a couple of hours after we talked, and God, one of your clinicians just reached right out. I mean, I was absolutely floored, and so, it's those kind of things and that kind of response time that shows what real great leadership is, because it's all about kindness, it's all about compassion, it's all about empathy. You exude every one of those things. So I know it's a dozen years later, but I want to thank you for that.
Well, no, thank you, Todd, and appreciate you making that connection and probably changed the trajectory of that young person's life.
You did 100%. Um, so let's kind of get into this a little bit, right? You once compared the meticulous maintenance we give military equipment like rifles and Humvees to the lack of maintenance we give the human mind. How do you see leaders in any industry, regardless of whether it's military or life science or nonprofit, apply that sort of preventative maintenance of their soul to the teams before a burnout or breakout happens?
Yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon, and I think first of all, in the military, we're getting better at it, but they still need some work. And to your point, um, it is drilled into our brains that you do, they call it operative maintenance, and it's pre, during, and post. And it doesn't matter whether it is a rifle, a machine gun, a radio, or a helicopter, it's the same process. And you do that, quite frankly, to ensure the longevity and the functionality of the equipment. And that's why we have trucks that are 40 years old. I mean, who would drive around in a 40-year-old truck unless it said antique on it and you were going to a show, right?
Right.
Who would fly a 40-year-old helicopter? When you look at our Apaches and our Blackhawks, those came out in the 80s. Uh, you know what I mean? But they're still running beautifully well because we maintain them. The challenge we saw in the military was that we would do amazing stuff physically to ensure the readiness of our warriors, but we did very little, if anything, on the mental health. Um, as we sent them into harm's way for anywhere from 7 months to 15, 18 months. And then when they returned home, there was a working assumption that everyone was okay unless they told us otherwise. And quite honestly, it was the exact opposite. Everybody was probably not okay and needed a little bit of assistance coming back. And quite frankly, if we'd done a little bit more on the front end, they probably would have been more resilient going into those difficult places. And then you got to, if you did the post operation maintenance like we did on all our equipment, I think we would have been able to forego some of these problems. And so when you transition to the military and you take a look at the private sector, I think it still holds true because we all saw the devastation uh, caused by the coronavirus pandemic. And we saw how it transformed the way we conduct business, and everybody sort of went remote because you didn't have another option. And we developed great technology like this platform to have a nice conversation without both of us having to meet at some place to accomplish the same task, right? Um, and through that, I think we were able to buy people more time with their family during that very difficult time. And I think that really helped people get through it because on top of everything, they didn't have to drive to Boston, for example, from the suburbs, which could take an hour on the way in, an hour on the way home, and then they were there worried about does somebody over there sneezing or coughing, and am I going to get something? I'm going to bring it home. So there was peace of mind with some of that. And then in the years that have followed, we've kind of gotten away from that a bit. There's been more of a return to work. I think at home base we've kept a hybrid kind of program so that folks can still benefit from both sides. But I think as leaders, we have to do a better job of keeping an eye on our teammates. Um, and checking in with them. And in the Army, we call buddy checks, and everybody gets a buddy assigned to them when we're overseas to keep an eye on each other. And if you're in the field and you have to go use a latrine or you have to go use the woods, you don't go alone. You have somebody help you with that and follow you out there just to keep an eye on you to make sure you're okay. But more than that, once you have that buddy, you have a responsibility to keep an eye on each other and check in with each other. And as leaders, you have that same overarching responsibility to do that. And the easiest way I would tell you, that it can be accomplished is, we call it counseling by coffee cup. Um, and it's just, around the break room or, in a meeting, have somebody hang back for a few minutes and have a coffee or iced tea with them and have a chat and just see how they're doing and keep an eye on them. If somebody's not doing well, connect them to the resources that your company offers. But step one is just engaging and having a conversation and not being afraid to be a little vulnerable and have that, explain that, we all have challenges. And when you look at the world today, I mean, gee, it's like it's a very difficult environment. We have these incredible external threats to this country, as well as internal threats, and people are beleaguered in many cases because they were just starting to come back from COVID, and all of a sudden the political divisiveness in the country took over, and it
Yeah.
took it to another level. And you can't have, good conversations with folks because you've got this thing in the middle that often drives a wedge. And we've got to get away from it. We've got to heal as a country. We've got to move past that. And it starts with conversations.
No, I think that's a great point, and I do like the analogy with just having the cup of coffee with somebody, even though I don't drink coffee.
Neither do I.
The fact of the matter is that concept. Maybe we should make
Iced
that into a
tea.
T-shirt.
Yeah. I don't drink coffee.
Um, but it is interesting. You talked about vulnerability, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but and certainly I see it in the real world, but I would tend to think more so in the military historically that strength is often defined by what you can kind of endure in silence. Uh, but I know that at home base, you folks are really trying to teach veterans that having that conversation, having the courage to talk about whatever the pain is that they're feeling is how you start to manage it. And we certainly have a mindset in terms of how we view military leaders as being pretty stoic, right? And you having been a general for a long time, how do you, as a leader, how do you transition from that mindset of being a stoic general who's mission focused to now advocating for folks with this sort of radical idea of emotional honesty?
Yeah, I think it's time and place, right? And situation dependent. And so in the military, um, we teach our folks to be resilient, self-reliant, self-starters, and we teach them to play hard. That and that's a big deal because if you're out on a combat patrol and you twist your ankle, there's a question: are you hurt or you're injured? If you're hurt, we'll tell them to suck it up. That's why we invented duct tape and 800 milligram Motrin, right? You gotta carry on with the mission because, you could pretty much stop a mission dead in its track if you have to pause and call for a medevac to pull somebody out and bring them to the rear. And,
Right.
and so, they need to be injured, not just hurt. We're all hurt. You're falling out of airplanes, you're jumping out of helicopters, you're banging your knee on tanks and the inside of it. And so there's always a lot of injury. I mean, you get hurt quite a bit. Um, but are you hurt or injured? And if you're injured, you require medical attention. Um, and that's a different situation. And so if you're injured, we want you to get help because you can't play with a broken ankle. You're
Right.
going to become a liability for the organization. You can play when you're hurt a little bit, and we do teach them to play hurt. When you come home from that combat environment, you've got to recognize, number one, the difference, and the threshold is different. And you don't need to play hurt anymore when you're back in the rear, when you're back in America, in the safety of daily garrison routine, or you're back in the civilian world. You get help as soon as you can. You address your medical issue, you address your mental health issue, so that you can then get back into the swing of things. But that a lot of this challenges, we spent so much time teaching folks to be self-reliant and resilient. um, they feel like they're a little bit weak if they can't deal with mental health stuff. If they got a fractured ankle, they will obviously go in and get help, you know what I mean? But when it comes to mental health, they feel like they're just not feeling it, and that's a personal shortcoming. Um, and so they'll try and keep going on and keep going on. And that's why, quite frankly, we had a we graduated 24 veterans from our intensive 2-week clinical program. One of the warriors that graduated today was a Vietnam veteran, and
Wow.
he's been carrying this pain for 50 years.
Yeah. I can't
50
even imagine.
years.
I
and
can't even imagine that.
and as I listen to
There was a
him,
stigma, right, in terms of that mindset and coming out of that generation, that it was a sign of weakness.
it was a sign of weakness. In some other cases, I've heard them say, well, that's my cross to bear for the things I've done. And there's all sorts of reasons. And it's also, PTSD is an injury of avoidance. And so they just don't want to revisit it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. Uh, and it's so remarkable sometimes when you meet the spouses of these Vietnam guys, and they'll share with you that my boyfriend became my husband and he went to war, and my boyfriend never came home. The guy I met, the guy I fell in love with, the guy I married, and after 50 years, I just got him back. For the last 50 years, I've had this angry, frustrated person that I don't really know, and I don't quite understand. And once they let that go and they move on and they heal, they get back to the person they once were. And that's what we try and do, is help them reclaim their lives. You don't need to wait 50 years. If you're not doing well, get some assistance. And quite frankly, as I share with the folks at graduation, home base doesn't fix anybody. Home base works with you, provides you with the tools. Again, you're a self-starter, you're a self-reliant person. But if you try and change a flat tire with a screwdriver, you're not going to get very far. And if you don't have the tools to deal with some of these complex mental health challenges, you're not going to get very far. And that's what happens. They try and try and try to get over it, as they say. You always say get over it, but they can't, because they hit a stuck point and they don't have the tools to do it. We give them the tools so that they can then reclaim their life, and then they can not only um, move past that stuck point, they can then um, have the resilient skills so that when they face those challenges in the future, as you will when life happens, they're equipped to deal with them.
No, yeah, it's amazing, that story just of the Vietnam vet who was stuck for 50 years in that changeover, right? And it was a behavioral thing because our personalities typically don't change, but we can alter our behaviors. I mean, I wrote my senior thesis in 1990 on post traumatic stress, and back then there was very little literature about it. But the fact that Now we're at a point where we've got a lot of soldiers coming off of various wars over the last 20 years. The fact that you guys have created a space for them that allows them to feel comfortable and feel vulnerable so they can heal is huge. And it's interesting when you think about it because Mr. Rogers, created his neighborhood, right? And the concept was that the neighborhood was supposed to be safe for every child. The neighborhoods that your soldiers were in were some of the most dangerous environments on earth. And so when you look back at your career in the military as a leader who clearly has the capability to be compassionate, has the capability to be kind, has the capability to be empathetic, not just because you're in this role with home base, but in your role as a general. What were some of the sort of Roger-esque things that you tried to do or that your staff tried to do to make your soldiers feel seen and feel valued as human beings, even while they were in some of these dangerous places?
I think there's a couple things that we try and do. And, in the military, one of the things we talk about is leading from the front, which means you wouldn't ask your soldiers to do anything you're not willing to do. And so back when I was a younger officer, a lieutenant colonel back in Iraq and Afghanistan, um, I used to purposely go out on patrol every night with a different group of folks. So I had that shared experience, and nobody could say, "Oh, he's just sending off. He doesn't understand what's going on." And so when you're out there at night with them on patrol and bad things happen, and you're with them, you're sharing that experience. And then when you get back to the base, you can kind of talk through it with them a little bit. And as I got more senior, it's not as practical to do that because you can actually create more problems if the bad guys find out there's a general traveling with them. Now I put a bullseye on these
Big
guys, and
target on the
that's
whole
not
crew.
helpful, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you'd still do those check-ins. And I can remember we had a couple young soldiers that were manning a tower on one of our bases, and some bad guys pulled up, and there really wasn't much ballistic protection. It was corrugated tin, so and they had some sandbag stuff, and they just pulled up in a pickup truck, got out, and fired AK-47s into the tower where they were. The two young soldiers were very brave. They returned fire, suppressed the fire, and kept it up until others came and the bad guys left. And I went and spent some time with the guys. I sat in the tower with them afterwards and had a conversation because I knew they were rattled. It's not natural for somebody to pop out of a vehicle and start shooting a AK-47 at you. And so we had a conversation. As we're talking, I remember, one of the kids' hands was shaking a bit as he was reaching for his canteen, and he apologized. I said, "Don't apologize. That was probably the scariest thing you've ever experienced." And I said, "Right now, you've got your body is loaded with nervous energy, and it's got to find a way out. And your knees popping up and down, that's part of it, your hands shaking." And I said, "Give it some time and you'll be fine." And I said, "If you're not, though, make sure you talk to somebody because, it's not normal to get shot at. And your response to this be, that outside stimulus is overwhelming. If you weren't rattled by it a little bit, I'd be more worried about you." And it's normal to do it. And when you normalize it and you explain to them, these are tough times, but we're here for you. And then after that, I get down out of the tower and I found out, I talked to his commander and I said, make sure his squad leader, his first line supervisor, keeps an eye on him because, he was pretty rattled by this. And for the next few days, just keep an eye on him. And if he doesn't need to go up in the tower, maybe he can do something else tomorrow where he doesn't have to go back into that tower right so quick. And we can kind of shift the things around a little bit. So he's not crawling back into that same tower that, it was pretty scary. There's other things you can do tomorrow and somebody else can spend a little time in that tower. But there's all sorts of ways that you can, number one, relate and kind of acknowledge that it's a scary environment, and talk it through with them, or you share the experience with them, and talking through it again is a lot. And in the military, like other probably police departments and probably fire services, there's some gallows humor, some dark humor, and that's another way that you get through stuff. And after you get back off the a bad ambush or something, there's a lot of nervous laughter and joking, but it's a way to let it out of your body, and kind of normalize a very abnormal situation, and make it manageable. And then you keep an eye on things and see who bounces back and who doesn't. And if they seem like they're still struggling with that, and then you get the chaplain involved in some other things, get them to behavioral health, and kind of work on it a little bit more while you're there. It's staying connected, I think, is a big part, and sharing the experience with those that you work with.
I mean, that's where the empathy comes along as far as great leadership. And it's interesting you talk about sort of the handshaking or the knee shaking. I mean, we do have a physiological response to stress that impacts our nervous system. And the fact that you kind of acknowledge that for them also probably lightens the load mentally a little bit as well, because those are things that we can't necessarily, excuse me, control. So I think that's great. I mean, that's a great tactic to be able to use as you're talking through. And again, the idea of being empathetic with them is hugely important. And to your point, when you're out on patrol with them and you're in it, right? Your sleeves are rolled up. And to me, that's great leadership because it levels the playing field, so to speak. And you don't see yourself as above anybody else. And to me, that's the hallmark of leadership. So I think that's great. And obviously now transitioning to home base, you can still relate to the veterans because you've gone through some of the same things. But one of the things that I think we tend to lose track of in terms of, and I've part of the genesis of this podcast for me was the idea that, when you have a bad experience at work or, you get a lousy boss, excuse me, you're going to take that with you, right? That's going to follow you home. It's going to follow you in terms of your treatment of your spouse or your kids. And that's not a good thing either. And I know that home base uh, does a great job of treating the entire family, not just the veteran. And so, and we look at the family of these veterans, like this woman who's been married to the vet from Vietnam for 50 plus years. She's a helper. And Fred Rogers was a big proponent of finding helpers, acknowledging helpers, but also helping helpers. And so when you look at your role or as a leader role, what do you think that leader can do to support sort of their invisible team behind the employees?
Yeah, it's funny. In the military, it's a little easier because our families are part of our responsibility. The welfare of our families. If you're is like a team leader, um, 20-year-old kid in charge of five other soldiers, or a squad leader in charge of 10, um, they might only be 23, 24 years old. They're not only responsible for their 10 soldiers, but they're also responsible for those 10 soldiers' family. So if something's going on at home, they have to know about it. They have to figure out, help find solutions, find resources to help. If somebody has a sick kid and it's affecting their performance, they're expected to throw themselves into it and then work with the chain of command to help find a solution, because we don't want anybody um, worrying alone. And that's a great line I learned, and I want to share it with you. Our chief nurse from Mass General was also the chief nurse for something called Boston Hope, which was back in
I
the
know that. Yep.
COVID pandemic. Governor Baker asked us at home base to establish a 1,000 bed COVID field hospital. And one of the first key players I picked up on my team um, was this great woman, Dr. Jeanette Ives Erickson, who was the chief nurse of Mass General for a number of years and became ours. And you can imagine, very tumultuous time period. And this kind of pivots to the private sector. We saw some of the challenges with healthcare workers during the COVID pandemic. On one occasion, we found one of our young nurses 3 hours after her shift ended in the fetal position, sobbing in the locker room, the break room, whatever. Um, and one of the things Jeanette shared with us through her great experience at Mass General was that nobody needs to worry alone. Together, we can solve problems. No one has to bear that whole burden by themselves. And I think that's the best lesson to pivot to the private sector as a part of a leadership team. Never let a team member, be subjected to trying to solve a problem by themselves. And they've got to know that you're open to helping them, because again, while we fight the stigma of self-reliancy in the military, there's still that personal belief in the private sector that you don't want to show somebody you can't handle something, because they'll give it to somebody else next time that can. Um, and when you're a little more vulnerable and share with them that we understand there's going to be challenges that you can't overcome, that you're going to need help with, we don't want you spinning out trying to do it yourself. Of course, give it your best shot, but if you hit the wall and then you try it again, you still hit the wall. We don't want you worrying about this thing by yourself and trying to torture yourself trying to get through it, because you bring two or three other people in there and you get this diverse viewpoint of leadership and other coworkers looking at it, that 360 degrees looking at that same problem, you're going to find a solution. And if there's no solution, we're going to collectively come to that agreement that this is not good. This is not something we're going to fix. Let's look at doing something different, because try as we may, collectively we can't find a solution. But not letting anyone worry alone, I think, is a huge win for an organization to take that mindset on, and leaders to share that with their team members so they know when they do hit the wall that there's help on the horizon.
I that's great, and you know it's interesting because it has to come from leadership, right? They need to let their folks know that when you hit a wall, asking for help is okay. Asking for help is a sign of strength, right? We talked about the vulnerability in terms of the military and how handling things yourself is never a great thing if you can get help from other people. And I think that's wonderful advice. And more leaders need to do that. They need to be able to say, hey, this is an assignment that you might get that you may not be able to solve yourself, and that's okay. That's why we have a team. That's why we have a company. That's why we have people in different roles, because they all add value. And when people see that, they're more likely to say, "Oh, okay, you know what? I can't get through this. I would rather use my time more wisely. Let's solve this together, and we can work on something else after that more quickly." So, uh, you know, you mentioned a little earlier the what we've got right now and how divisive the world is, especially here in our country. Fred Rogers once said that mutual care is what eventually will make our world safe. And you look at the veterans who've come through your program. What gives you the most hope as you see them and you see the challenges that they get through and they get out to the other side, even if it takes 50 years for somebody to get through that? What really gives you the most hope that we can actually heal these divisions and what are really invisible wounds within the wider society today?
Yeah, I think, and you make a great example. So when I look at today, I had a graduation for two cohort groups of 12 that went through this intensive 14-day clinical program for PTSD, whereby we compressed 2 years of therapy into 14 days. That's a lot. Um, but one of the things we realized was, there was two ways to approach it. We could have had a rolling admission as people come in, they start their own individual journey, or we could do it as a team. And we opted for a team. In the Army, the basic element of our whole structure is a squad of 10 to 12 people, and they become exceptionally close. I mean, they may not love everybody, but they work together and they respect each other, and they would do anything for each other, even though they may not, personally, they may not get along that great. You're never going to get 10 people in the room and everybody's just going to be, it's not going to be a love fest.
I can barely do that at
Especially,
my own dinner table with the Jen and the two girls, so I get
yeah.
it.
And when you then place yourself in a difficult situation where people's true colors come out, it can get worse, right? And so what we found is, um, by these folks working together, opening up to each other, um, they create this amazing peer support group, and we see this happen every 2 weeks. Day one for this program, it's hoodies up, eyes down, nobody talking, a lot of angry people because life hasn't been going well. Day 14, it's laughing, joking, and I love you, man. Stay in touch, and they set up a text chain, a closed Facebook thing, where they can connect with each other. whenever they're not feeling it. And they've got 4 or 5 folks that they can lean on by sending out a text, I'm not doing great today. There'll be 4 or 5 folks that jump right in. One might even call and say, I'll be on a plane in 5 minutes. You know what I mean? And having that level of support is really huge. So that gives me hope because these guys come from a mixed background of gender, race, socioeconomic, enlisted, officer, blue, red, north, south, east, west. I mean, it's the full because we fly in these 24 veterans from anywhere in the United States and anywhere U.S. veterans living anywhere in the world. We fly them in for this program at no cost, and so you get a mixed bag with every 12-person group. And they've asked us in the past, how did you know to put us together and we'd work so well? Like totally random. You guys figure it out because you're together and you work at it, right? And I can tell you as a teenager when I probably was working my mom's last nerve and she was trying to tell me something I wasn't listening. She said, "Remember, you have 2 ears and one mouth. Use them in that priority." And that, you got to listen. You got to be willing to listen. And when you look at the divisiveness, that's what we don't see is when people stop listening to each other and try and find common ground. Because this isn't the first time in our nation's history that we've had polarized beliefs. And I had the great pleasure to have an uncle who was Tip O'Neill's chief of staff when he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives for Congress. And I would hear the inside stories about how O'Neill would be playing cards with Nixon after work and other big, staunch Republicans. And he was a dyed in the wool Democrat. And at the end of the day, though, that neither one changed their values, beliefs, or anything, but they played cards at night. They drank a little bourbon and they talked. And they would actually score out the day and say, "You really got me today. You set me up and knocked me down pretty hard. Yeah, but I got something for you tomorrow." And they'd all laugh about it because they didn't let it get personal.
Yeah.
And then they would make deals. They say, "All right, I can bend on this, but I need you to bend on this." And then we can get a package together we can both work on. I think that's part of what we're missing is the willingness to collaborate for the greater good. And I think the country's getting sick and tired of it. We're tired of demonizing two different groups, the Hatfields and McCoys, because collectively, neither one's getting anything done and they're working on the polar fringe stuff instead of the common good. And I'm hoping over the next year or two that our political leaders realize that they need to do better. They need to work with each other. Or we're going to continue to fail as a nation moving forward and addressing some pretty difficult challenges. And the problem is when they fail like that and they create these public spectacles, the folks that align themselves with whatever political belief they have, they make it part of their own ideology and it's part of them now. And so they're not willing to, compromise their view. And so it goes from being political challenges to national challenges because large groups of people aren't willing to talk and listen to each other. And so we need to, going back to my mom, you have 2 ears and a mouth, use them in that order.
And your mom's advice is great. But going back to what you were talking about with the cohorts and the differences they have, at the end of the day, I look at various aspects of what makes somebody a great leader, and it's the acknowledgement of our shared humanity, and that's really the baseline. And clearly, this cohort of 12 individuals coming again, socioeconomic, gender, race, etc. They found that shared humanity. And I think that if more leaders can kind of promote that as a baseline, we will be better off functioning not just politically and sort of in the national spectrum of things, but also in our own little worlds, whether it's our company, a nonprofit, doesn't matter. But if we can all sort of acknowledge that, hey, we might have these other differences, we have a shared humanity. And if we use that as the baseline, it definitely will work to our advantage to kind of get through this. So I think that was a great example that you gave with that cohort, being able to kind of get through that. But I sort of have an interesting question for you now because you and I, we're both older. We've lived our lives or part of our lives. Hopefully, we've got a lot more to live. But you have these experiences, and you've had quite a number of experiences professionally and personally, and now sort of where you are with home base. When you look back 40 years, right, when you were a young lieutenant, and you think about Mr. Rogers and his concept of leading with the heart, what would be the advice you'd give to yourself, if any? I mean, maybe you're like, I was perfect. But if there's any advice that you would give to yourself looking back, what would it be?
I think, with age comes some wisdom, hopefully, and it's a lot of times because you chipped your teeth a couple times along the way, and you wish you would have a mulligan on some things. And at different points in my career, I know I could have been a little more compassionate. And as a young lieutenant, you know, you're full of fire and vinegar, and you're there, and they raise you and grow you to do that, to be a hard charger, and you're at the tip of the spear of leadership, where you have a 30 person platoon, and that, you've got a team, a squad, and a platoon. That is the first level of operational mission capability. And so a lot's riding on you. And they talk to you about, don't accept anything substandard, because if you do that, you've now created a new standard. If somebody doesn't salute you, don't walk by. You can't let that go, because you're letting standards slip. And when they stop doing that, they'll stop doing something else, and then it can become dangerous, et cetera. Um, I think, older me would tell younger me that, number one, there's a way to correct somebody. You don't have to snap at them. And I tried not to, and I thought I was pretty good at it. But I also know, I don't think I dug a little deeper where I could have, to find out why a soldier was having a problem. I focused on the problem and fixing the problem, and I would try and be polite and respectful about it. But I didn't peel the onion back to say, why is this guy having a tough time? Because instead of, I tried to solve the first tier problem, which was on the surface. The guy was late. The guy failed to salute. The guy's uniform wasn't where it needed to be. I made the on the spot correction. You need to square that away. You know the standards, blah, blah, blah. And I did it politely and respectfully. And I never yelled at him in front of other people. You pull them aside and have that conversation. But I don't think I did a very good job of finding out why. You know, is he not feeling good? Is he homesick? Is he in a fight with his spouse and it's not going well? You know what I mean? Does he have a sick kid? Or is she a single mom trying to juggle a bunch of different things? And yeah, all I had to do is get up this morning as a young single lieutenant, throw on my uniform and come to work, where she might have one or two children, and she had to get them ready, get them to school, get everybody ready, get her uniform on. She had about 8 other tasks to get there. And somebody, she got derailed because one of the kids was sick at daycare that morning. Um, and having those conversations, find out why there was a problem, and help solve the problem, and not just solve the tip of the iceberg issue that I witnessed. I think I probably would have, you know advised myself to try and solve the problem, and be a little more helpful in figuring out that solution, so that that soldier, who's normally pretty good, is back where they need to be.
I'm sure you did the best that you could, and it sounds like you did, but it is a good point. I think that empathy starts with asking questions. And I know your mom said, listen then talk, but sometimes you just have to ask the question, and then you can spend your time listening. And, again, just another hallmark of this whole program and leadership is finding a way in and finding a way to help understand what might, again, cause somebody simply just not to salute when they typically do. And I think that's the great point, and that certainly would be great advice. I mean, compassion is free, and so are all the other things like empathy and kindness. But I get that sometimes it's difficult. It's difficult for some bosses to do that. But overall, when most leaders behave in that way where you feel valued, you feel heard, they're not going to then take it out down the road, right? They might say, geez, Lieutenant, are you having a bad day, right? And so it becomes reciprocal. And I think that goes back to that idea of shared humanity around how we behave towards each other, how we can be empathetic to each other, and therefore become more kind, become more compassionate, and just become better as leaders in our respective fields. So
Yeah.
listen, Jack, as always, this is great. I appreciate it. Your advice is wonderful. Your stories are fantastic. I can tell you that you'd certainly be a CEO that I would have loved to have worked for, or if my mom would have let me join the military, I would have happily served under you. But that was never going to happen. Um, but I appreciate you, and I appreciate what you guys are doing now with the home base program, and the lives you're changing for the better through the program. Again, even if it's a 50-year, Vietnam vet or a kid that might be coming back from Iran in a month. It's an important program, and the idea that you folks are focusing on how do we help you help yourself is fantastic. So I just want to thank you.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks for having me today.
No, it is my pleasure. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll catch up soon.
All right. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, Jack. Bye.